I'd like to welcome Father Cassian Sibley to be our keynote speaker of the Great Lenten Lecture Series for 2022. I'm very happy to have Father Cassian come to speak with us about Orthodox Christianity in Africa. And some of you may be surprised that there is even Orthodox Christianity in Africa. That means that I haven't been doing a very good job as your priest. So Father Cassian's going to correct that today. So without further ado, let me welcome Father Cassian, who is the rector of the Theotokos Life-Giving Spring Parish in College Station, Bryant, Texas. For those of you who may be thinking you've heard that before, that's where Texas A&M is. So Father's serving in that community. Without further ado, let's welcome Father Cassian.
Afternoon, I'm not sure what it is right now. Africa, Orthodoxy has been in Africa for a very long time. North Africa was where Saint Athanasius and the development of monasticism in the Theban desert, and all of these things happened. But by the 5th century, the schism had struck, and the church was divided into two groups, Coptic and Byzantine Orthodox, with two rival popes. And the early missionary efforts to the sub-Saharan Africa in Abyssinia and Nubia really ended up falling under the Coptic Church. So there was only a brief interregnum during which Byzantine Orthodoxy actually reached south of the Sahara. After the Muslim conquest, everybody was struggling for survival, and that's pretty much the way things were until quite recently, until the 18th, 19th century. I would, however, going back to this period, I would like to speak briefly about the last glorified Orthodox saint of sub-Saharan Africa. His name was King Caleb, or Elisban, as it's come down to us in Greek, and you will sometimes see icons of him. He was a contemporary of Saint Justinian, and arguably his community was a Monophysite community. He was the king of Abyssinia, and he intervened on behalf of Yemenite Christians in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, who were being killed by a new ruler who was trying to reimpose Judaism on that particular community. And Saint Justinian made an appeal to King Caleb on behalf of the Orthodox Christians who dwelt in Saudi Arabia, and he did in fact intervene militarily in an effort to save these Christians. The pious story is that he failed in his first military campaign, and he was confused about this. It seemed like to him it was a just and worthy cause, but he had been repulsed. He had failed, and so he went for spiritual guidance. And the priest that he spoke with said, "Look, the problem is you're proud. You're not going to be able to win this victory for the faith while you are so proud." And so he made a vow that he would give up his crown and that he would become a hermit if he was able to be successful. And he then successfully defeated the king and made the Saudi Arabian Peninsula safe for Orthodox Christians. He went then into seclusion as a hermit, and he sent his crown to Saint Sophronios in Jerusalem to be hung up there in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, he's an interesting character because technically speaking, he was a Monophysite. He was from a Monophysite community, but his act was an act on behalf of the Orthodox Christian faith, and is also indicative of the fact that the distinction between monasticism and orthodoxy wasn't terribly clear at the time. It didn't mean as much to Africans as it meant to people in Egypt, where the actual dispute had arisen. And I think that he's an interesting figure for us in this current contemporary situation in Africa for these reasons. The other thing I find interesting about him is here is a man who is an African king. He is the last Orthodox saint. Did I see a single icon of him all the time I was in Africa? Not one. Not one anywhere. Never did see him. None of the Africans had ever even heard the story. However, in virtually every church in Africa, there's an icon of Saint Demetrios on the back of a horse spearing an Ethiopian. Which, suggests perhaps that some of the missionary efforts in Africa have been a little bit tone deaf in their dealing with Africans. And I think that this is reflected by the rest of the story I am going to tell you. In order to understand Christianity in Africa, you first have to get rid of any kind of benign notions that you have of colonialism. Europeans just sailed around Africa until the plantation economy started in North America, and then all of a sudden Africa was extremely useful for slaves, and it became a center for slave trade. And then once the slave trade started to trickle out or started to fail, the Europeans got very busy parceling up Africa for its mineral wealth. That essentially there was a war on a battle, a scramble for Africa is what they call it, in which every European power wanted a big chunk of Africa that they could exploit. And that pretty much is the situation into which the modern missionary effort and the first Christianity entered into Africa. By and large, the missionaries were opposed to slavery, but they were very big on promoting commerce and colonial rule and colonial government. So the African experience was that Christianity and colonialism were linked. They came hand in hand, and there were benefits and downsides to that from both sides. Starting in Uganda, which is the country I know best, in 1885 through 1887, there's the story of the Ugandan martyrs. These were 23 Anglicans and 22 Catholics, Roman Catholics, who were martyred by Mwanga II, the king of Uganda. He became convinced that the Christians and the Muslims were trying to undermine his kingdom, and so basically he made an arrangement whereby the Christians in his kingdom, the young Christians would have to submit to him sexually, or they would be killed. And so, as a consequence, these young men refused in mass, and they were executed by the king. And this is a seminal event in Ugandan history. It marks the end of paganism, the failure of paganism to hold on, and Christianity's hold on the African mind there locally. Our story, the story of Orthodox Christianity, begins about 30 years later with two men who were Anglicans. One of them, they were products of the Anglican school system, and one of them was a deacon, an Anglican deacon. And these two young men were called Obadiah and Reuben Spartus. Reuben Spartus was very fond of everything Greek. He was fond of Greek mythology and so forth. And when his brother-in-law sent him some letters from when he was in the military, saying, I'm beginning to wonder about this Anglicanism thing. It's not really satisfying my religious needs, and I think maybe we should consider looking into Roman Catholicism. young Sparta said, well, let's hold on. Let's not make any fast snap decisions about this. Let's do research. And being a smart guy, he proceeded to pull out the Encyclopedia Britannica at the local mission. And at one point, he was reading along and he discovered the Encyclopedia Britannica article on orthodoxy. And it is said that he jumped up and yelled, "Eureka," and ran out into the street saying, "I have found it, I have found it. I am no longer Anglican, I am Orthodox." It took him about 20 years to actually find orthodoxy, or to get anybody in the Orthodox world to pay any attention to him after that. But from that moment, he was convinced that the true church was the Orthodox Church if he could only locate it and get somebody to come and tell him something about it. Their first efforts, they found out that there was something called an African Orthodox Church in America. They had heard about this from some servants who worked at a German plantation in Tanganyika who had come from America. And so they wrote off to the leader of this group in America, Father George McGuire, or Bishop George McGuire, who had sought affiliation with Orthodoxy as a black jurisdiction. He met with Bishop Alexander of the Russian Orthodox Church in America, who was fascinated and interested by, but decided that this whole business of having exclusive ethnicity was probably not something that the Russian Orthodox Church wanted to get into in the middle of the Russian Revolution, and he turned him down. So this man ended up being ordained by Vagantes. But it was part of the whole Marcus Garvey, Back to Africa, Pan-Orthodox movement. And part of what they were trying to do was to form a genuinely African church. So he sent a letter, Sparta sent a letter to this guy, and 3 years later he gets a response. And it says, we've got a guy that's affiliated with our group who's in South Africa. Contact him. So then there's another 2-year interregnum where he's trying to get a hold of the guy in South Africa. And he does, in fact, finally locate this man, Archbishop Alexander, who makes him a reader by letter. And upon having been established as a reader, he proceeded to found the Orthodox Church of Uganda, the Orthodox Church in Africa. And he described it as a church established for all right-thinking Africans, men who want to be free in their own house, not always being thought of as boys. So from the very beginning, there was a connection between orthodoxy and the quest for orthodoxy and the notion that Africans were grown-up citizens and could make decisions for themselves. Archbishop Alexander came, visited, taught them a little, taught them what he knew about Orthodoxy, which wasn't much, and ordained 2 of them as priests and 2 of them as deacons. And before he left, there was a Greek guy in town, in Kampala, who wanted his daughter to be baptized. And hearing that these were Orthodox Christians, he invited them to come and baptize his daughter. But when the baptism ceremony was done, it was so completely different than anything he'd ever seen in a Greek Orthodox church that he waited until Bishop Alexander left and then went to Sparta and said, Father Sparta, I'm beginning to suspect that guy's not really Orthodox. Maybe you should contact, some real Orthodox people, the Greek Orthodox. There's a priest called Father Nicholas Sarakas in Tanzania, serving a Greek community there. And I hear that he's teaching Orthodoxy to Africans as well, so maybe you should contact him. Sparta immediately broke, upon finding out that Bishop Alexander wasn't real Orthodox, he immediately broke with him, contacted Father Nicodemus Sarikas, and Father Nicodemus invited them 2 at a time to come to his home to teach them about Orthodoxy and to catechize them properly. And he also intervened on their behalf with the Patriarch of Alexandria, asking the Patriarch of Alexandria to consider their admission into the Orthodox faith. Father Nicholas Sirikis is also interesting because when he first went to Africa, it was in Johannesburg, and he was serving a Greek community there, but he made the mistake of actually reaching out to African communities and starting to baptize and catechizing Africans. The Johannesburg community wasn't at all interested in that. They weren't interested in having Africans in their parish, and so they told Father that his services were no longer needed, and he was transferred from Johannesburg to Tanzania, which is why he was anywhere in the neighborhood when Father Sparta and Father Obadiah needed him. So it took 14 years from when he decided he was Orthodox till when he received the official patriarchal blessing in 1946. But during that time, he continued to build churches. He continued to teach people everything he knew about the Orthodox faith. In 1936, he had 5,000 parishioners in 30 parishes with 23 church schools and 1 monastery convent. By 1946, when he was officially admitted into the Patriarchate, there were 10,291 parishioners in 56 parish centers. These two men who were sent off first to Cairo and then to Greece for training, and then back to the Alexandria where they were finally ordained as actual priests, and then sent back to Africa, managed to run this mission from a distance as the only 2 priests in the country. And they, and you would think, well, after that, things really took off, right? But actually, no, there was crickets. Basically, for the next 20 years, the Patriarch of Alexandria didn't do anything. They had ordained 2 African priests, and they sent some books in English that could be translated locally, and that was pretty much the sole contribution that Alexandria made to the advancement of Orthodoxy in Africa during that period of time. The first actual missionary bishop was appointed in 1958, Metropolitan Nicholas, and the first missionary priest was Archimandrite Chrysostomus, who served until 1967 and helped found the seminary in Nairobi. Anyway, the thing I want to point out about this is that for the first very, very long time, even after they got Orthodox priests, and then ultimately these guys were also ordained as suffragan bishops or as auxiliary bishops, they were serving a group of people that was by the period of time when they actually first got African bishops, there was maybe 150,000 to 300,000 Orthodox Christians being served by 2 priests and an occasional visiting Greek priest, and then being served by 2 bishops who were auxiliary bishops and couldn't actually do any ordinations or perform any functions beyond that of a priest without the direct assistance of the bishop that they were responsible to, who never actually visited the country. And so they were not provided a lot of assistance in the early days. I don't think Alexandria really knew what to do with them. It just seemed odd to them. And so that's all that happened. It created some distinctive features of African Orthodoxy. African Orthodoxy has lots of catechists. Catechists are people who are taught about the Orthodox Church and then who go and start new communities and teach them about Orthodox faith. Now, they can't offer any sacraments or whatever, but they can preach. And so a lot of African churches actually, for the first 30 or 40 years, looked like evangelical churches. There weren't any icons because nobody knew how to paint them. They only trickled in very slowly. They read scripture, they sang Orthodox hymns, and they preached. Which meant that sometimes it wasn't clear to either the Orthodox or to outsiders in what way this was different from evangelicalism. It was obviously in spirit, because once the bishops got there and started doing liturgy, everybody was quite happy about it. But the second thing that happened as a result of this is that since there weren't priests to go around, there wasn't anyone to hear confessions, which meant that the business of confessions really never became a part of Orthodox Christianity. It's hard for us to imagine, but I mean, to this day, I meet Orthodox Christians in Africa who have been Orthodox their entire life, who have never gone to confession, because it was never available. 4 or 5 years ago, the first time I went to Uganda, I asked how many confessors there were in the country. And there was some discussion amongst my African friends. They talked about it back and forth, and they said, well, we know there's 2, but there may be a 3rd. And that was it. I mean, nobody except, Alexandria in Greece and Greek Orthodoxy has this thing that you don't automatically become a confessor because you're made a priest. But that's something that's a blessing that's given after a later date. And that makes sense in a country that's filled with monasteries. Because people go to the parish priest for services, but then if they really want to make confession, they go to the local monastery. But there were no local monasteries in Africa. So when you transplant this sort of Greek Alexandrian model onto the African situation, it just meant that one of the sacraments just simply disappeared. It wasn't available for African Christians, and it's only now slowly being developed in Africa, and part of the distinctive character of African Orthodoxy. Reuben Spartus, Theodore Nakiamas, and George Gathuna of Kenya became the first African bishops of Africa. As I say, they were auxiliary bishops, and but there was continued growth. There were only 25 priests in the period ordained between the period of 1958 to 1969. And then in 1982, there were 25 priests for 150 parishes. And in 1990, thanks to the inspired missionary work of Archbishop Anastasios, who is now the Patriarch of Albania, he ordained 79 priests and 11 deacons in like 6 or 7 years of his work. But the church grew at such a rapid pace that meant that there was only 79 priests for over 250 parishes, which meant that there was a 1 priest to every 4.5 parish ratio. And that pretty much is where we are today. There's a tremendous dearth of priests for the lay people of Africa. Uganda continued to develop as a church. During this period of time, Idi Amin, around about 1980, in the late 70s, early 80s, Idi Amin came to power. And all of a sudden, it became actually beneficial for the Orthodox that they had black leadership by that point, and that they were seen as an indigenous church. Because Idi Amin didn't target them as he did the European churches. He targeted Anglicanism, he targeted Roman Catholicism, and he made a special point of elevating Orthodoxy to be one of the 4 religious faiths that was acknowledged in the country. So at that point, we got Orthodoxy got official status from the government, and it retains that official status to the government today. The only 4 churches that are officially recognized by the country of Uganda are Islam, Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, and Eastern Orthodoxy. So we do have a privileged position in that country, which makes Orthodox growth possible and gives a kind of respect to Orthodox leaderships. The last 2 bishops of Kampala, Uganda, have been Africans. Archbishop Jonah, whose picture is back there, he's the guy with me, a wonderful, lovely man who died last year. He was a bishop from 1997 onward. He was no longer a auxiliary bishop, but a bishop in his own right, a metropolitan. He founded 20 clinics and hospitals. He created a mothers' union to help with the problems of women and mothers in Africa. He helped establish the Syndismos Youth in Africa, Orthodox Scouting, and the Orthodox Christian Youth Network of Uganda, which I work with and have for several years. The story in Kenya was a little bit different. In Kenya, Orthodoxy became affiliated with the Mau Mau Rebellion. The link was explicit with the independence movement. And this, the Alexander, Archbishop Alexander from South Africa, that guy, was involved with these guys too. Basically, they heard about what happened in Uganda, and this group that had formed a teachers union to create only African schools in opposition to the British government, thought that maybe they'd never heard of a school that didn't have religion, right? All the schools were Roman Catholic or Muslim or Anglican. And so when they started their own blacks only, Africans only schools, they needed a church, or they thought they did. And so they sent off for Bishop Alexander, who came and ordained several of them. And this group became identified with the independence movement in opposition to the British government in Kenya. This was both a good thing and a bad thing. Good thing for growth, a bad thing when the British decided that they needed to be serious about cracking down. The British, during the Mau Mau emergency, had all of the Orthodox priests rounded up and put into concentration camps. And for about 10 years, all of the clergy of the Orthodox Church in Kenya were in concentration camps run by the British. This involved beatings, this involved torture. This was a very, very ugly time for those people. The British also burned down most of the Orthodox churches. The advantage is that when Jomo Kenyatta came to power, he saw Orthodox Christians as his allies and friends. These were people who had been with him in the quest for independence from the very earliest days. These were people who were not affiliated with Europe. These were people who were affiliated with Kenya and Kenyans. And so when I was growing up, going to boarding school in Africa, a lot of the government officials and etc. Were affiliated with Orthodoxy or were friendly to Orthodoxy in some way. It also led to a link between Archbishop Makarios II of Cyprus and the African Orthodox Church. Archbishop Makarios was involved in his own revolutionary war against oppressors, and he had been sent in 1958 into exile in the Seychelles. And so Archbishop Makarios was an archbishop, but he was also the leader of the independence movement in Cyprus. And so he came when he was released from Seychelles to be able to go back to Cyprus, he stopped by to visit his friends in Africa in Nairobi and went to the Orthodox Church and delivered a blistering, thundering, and very, very famous sermon about the immorality and the evils of colonialism at a time when the British government was still in power. The British government was outraged. How did anybody allow this guy in here? What was going on? But so there was a close relationship formed between the Cypriot people and the Kenyan Orthodox Church that ultimately led to Jomo Kenyatta giving a big chunk of land after independence, which then this government of Cyprus actually built a seminary on. It took about another five or 6 years for the African Orthodox Church to be able to find, people to staff it and to actually start the seminary. But that's how the African seminary in Nairobi actually began. The story was complicated, however, because in 1979, the Kenyan bishop, Bishop George Gathuna, was defrocked by the Patriarch of Alexandria. It seems to have been a dispute. The Patriarch of Alexandria is not terribly forthcoming about this, but it seems to have been a dispute about church ownership. there was two ways that you could register. You could register as a corporation, or you could register as an association. Associations had to be owned by Kenyans and couldn't be owned by foreigners. Corporations could be owned by foreigners. The Patriarch of Alexandria wanted everything to be registered as a corporation so that they could own it. The Africans wanted everything to remain associations so that the control over the land and the churches remained in the hands of Africans. And one of the things that happened to this is that the only black bishop in Kenya was defrocked by the Patriarch of Alexandria. He was, in fact, posthumously restored in 2006. But during the period of time that he was defrocked, he joined the Old Calendarist group. In fact, he joined the Old Calendarist group that I was actually originally ordained by, the Synod and Resistance. The Synod and Resistance Old Calendarist groups have a presence in East Africa to this day, mostly in Kenya. A couple of convents left and a few small churches. It's mostly the schism has been resolved, but there are still churches on both the Old and New Calendar in Kenya for this reason. Okay, the last country I'd like to take a look at real quickly is Tanzania. Tanzania, we've already talked about Father Nicholas Sarikas, who was so important, but in Bukoba, on the western shore of Lake Victoria, this community was served by visiting missionaries and priests and bishops from the Ugandan church. But there's also a very, very famous miracle that happened there as part of the evangelism of Africa. There was a priest, one of the earliest priests of the Orthodox Church to be in Tanzania, Father Sosothanes Kivonga, and he went to this community to bring them the gospel. And he was initially rebuffed. They weren't interested in what he was bringing to them. And so he said, "What is your problem? What is it that you need most? What is the hardest thing in your life for you right now?" And they said, "We have to walk 8 kilometers to get water. There's no well here. There's no place for us to get water. So it's 8 kilometers there and 8 kilometers back for our women every day in order to get water to survive here." And he said, "Fine, we'll pray to God." And he prayed to God and asked for a miracle, and God gave him a miracle. Spring gushed forth, and it happened in front of large numbers of people, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, pagans, the whole crowd, and the community is staunchly Orthodox to this day, and it is a community which, it was truly an amazing thing, and his grave is now a place of pilgrimage. People go to see his grave, to pray there. Also, the graves of Sparta and Obadias and some of these other early figures of Orthodoxy. In the south of Lake Victoria, there was another community that was founded by a guy called Paul Budala, who happened to be working in a factory with a Greek guy, just a blue-collar Greek guy who was working in the same factory as him, and he kept asking this guy about what his religion was, about Orthodoxy, and he kept asking more questions and more questions and more questions. And finally, the Greek guy was like, "I'm not getting any work done. You just keep asking me these questions. This is like, there's Orthodox in Uganda. You should ask them." And he did. He invited the bishop from Uganda, who came there and started teaching and baptizing Orthodox Christians there in that community. So anyway, the point here is that in Africa, Orthodoxy almost always happened because the Africans went looking for it. And nobody was interested in bringing Orthodoxy to Africans. I mean, it wasn't on the radar at all for Orthodoxy. There wasn't some big imperial Russian mission to Africa. The Greeks just happened to be in Africa because they were businessmen and because there were things to be bought and sold. And so they had these little communities that were served by priests from various groups. And there were some Russian and Serbian communities, particularly in South Africa, that were also served by priests from those communities. It wasn't until like the end of the 1990s that everybody agreed that the Patriarch of Alexandria would have general supervision over Africa, and the last parishes of the Serbian Orthodox Church and a couple of others were ceded to the Patriarch of Alexandria. But the African Church exists because Africans wanted it, and Africans from the very beginning believed that Orthodoxy was going to be more amenable or more open to their needs because it wasn't associated with colonialism. As you can see, it hasn't always worked out quite that way. In fact, there's an Anglican writer who lightly teases Orthodox Africans, saying, Anglicans were founded by the Church of England, and yet we've reached a point now where Anglicans in Africa get to elect all of their own leaders, own their own land, and have control of their own institutions. Whereas you guys were yelling revolution, 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 and now you got a Greek guy running things. And I think that to some extent, the promise of Orthodoxy wasn't, in that respect, didn't necessarily come to pass. But they did get Orthodoxy, and Orthodoxy continues to spread. And there is, I talked to Bishop Jonah, once again, a truly lovely man. I asked him about all these saints. So, Father Sosthenes, it was a public miracle. This entire community became Orthodox because of what happened there. And Father Sparta spent 30 years of his life chasing down Orthodoxy, and trying to bring it back to the community and starting an Orthodox church with no help from anyone. So when are these guys going to be glorified? When is the Patriarch of Alexandria going to glorify the saints? And his response was, you must be patient. Everything in Orthodoxy takes patience. There are 3 virtues in Orthodoxy: patience, patience, and patience. He says, as for the men who are saints, they are already glorified in our hearts. But we must be patient. The time will come when they will be glorified throughout all the world. Issues. There are colonial attitudes amongst the Greeks. As we already talked about the icons, they introduced the flying of the Greek flag. So every Orthodox church has a Greek flag on a flagpole, which indicates that they're Orthodox, which one can wonder about. There are too many institutions and not enough capital. The Greeks, once they actually did take over, kind of saw Africa as a charity case. They were less interested in expanding the church or building parishes or that sort of thing than they were taking care of the real needs of the poor in Africa. So they built hospitals, they built orphanages, they built schools. They engaged in a program of uplift. The problem is the institutions they created, there's no capital to fund them. The African church itself can't possibly fund them. So they can only survive on influxes of cash from outside. And it's a genuine problem. There just isn't any capital in Africa. Nobody's been interested in Africans having capital from day one. So all the materials go out of Africa and they get improved elsewhere, and somebody else gets all the value addition to the product, and none of that capital comes back to Africa. So the African Orthodox Church is in the same situation. They've got no capital, which means that they're completely dependent for the survival of their institution on people from outside supporting them. And the Greek economy collapsed in the middle of all of that. So all of a sudden, the money that was coming in from Greece wasn't available. There was no money coming in, which meant that the African Orthodox Church ended up being thrown onto the American Greek Church under Patriarch Bartholomew, because it was the only group that actually had money after the collapse of the Greek economy. And so there a much closer relationship ensued between those two bodies. It's also around that time, however, that Russian Orthodox, Russian Rokor, Serbians, and other groups, Romanians, became involved just because somebody had to help, or else they were going to lose their hospitals, they were going to lose their schools, they were going to lose their seminary, they were going to lose their colleges. There's a terrible problem in Africa of poverty and urbanification. People are moving out of the rural areas where they can support themselves, where they can feed themselves, where they have a community, into the cities with the promise of being able to make money, to be able to live like middle-class Americans, to be able to get education, professional jobs, etc. The problem is in Africa, you can get a master's degree and you can end up being somebody's cook or garden boy. There's no capital, so there's no jobs. So you get the education, but then you got nowhere to work. And as these people move in from the village, the Greeks initially thought of the Africans as a village church, as rural, and so they didn't actually buy any land in the cities. So there's no place to build the new parishes, which means that you've got only like 3 or 4 parishes in a city like Kampala that's got 5 million people. And so these overworked parishes are trying to deal with these large influxes of people from the country, and also dealing with the moral crisis of people who are no longer, there's so much enemy, they've got no relationship to the traditional sources of morality in their culture. And this has led to the importance of the need to serve youth, which at least Archbishop Metropolitan Luanga saw and was working on, and he's been replaced now with Archbishop Hieronymus, who is another Ugandan and who seems to have the same vision. There's also a problem with the relative absence of monasticism. In my country, where I grew up in Malawi, if somebody died without a child, they would bury you, they would put you in a hole, and then they'd throw 3 rats in after you before they buried you to indicate your worthlessness to the society, that you had not done anything to promote the next generation. So when you've got that kind of attitude toward people who don't produce children, then monasticism comes very, very hard. But it also means that it's very difficult to come up with bishops. And it's also very difficult to know what to do with priests. When a priest's wife dies and he's 35 years old, in a culture with those kinds of attitudes, it is extremely difficult, unless you want to just immediately promote him to being a bishop. It's very difficult to figure out what to do with the man, and all kinds of problems ensue. I can tell you, man, I could talk endlessly about this, but maybe you guys have questions. Obviously, one current problem is the conflict between Alexandria and Moscow, which is created by this Ukraine situation, and that hasn't gone away. But I think that perhaps the story of King Caleb is perhaps useful in this case. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how long the schism is going to last. We don't know. The Africans, by and large, don't have any. They've got nothing vested in it. They didn't make the decision by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and are a little bit bewildered by why they have all of a sudden been thrust into a conflict that had nothing to do with them and was not of their making, that they have to make a decision between Moscow and the Patriarchate of Alexandria, dividing communities and that sort of thing. They don't get it. They don't understand why. And I think it's not because they're ignorant, it's because they actually understand their own situation and recognize that it doesn't really have anything to do with them. And that they're being pulled into something that, not because it's of benefit to them, not because it's important to them, but because, other people are interested in making them choose sides. And I think we should probably reconsider that. And now I've gotten myself into trouble, so Father may not be able to put this on YouTube.
No. I expected you to dig the hole much deeper, Father. So
Okay, I'm glad I didn't dig it any deeper. So, any questions?
Father, could you go ahead? Could you talk a little bit about Father Cosmos in Zaire, because that was the next generation of missionaries that were going to Africa specifically to serve the people.
Yeah, I mean, Father Athanasius, now Tirana, is really, he really appealed to the missionary spirit amongst Greeks. There's this guy in Liberia who was a drummer or bass player for the rock and roll band The Flies in the 60s, who became Orthodox, became a monk, and went to Liberia and founded an orphanage and a clinic for people who were victims of landmines in Africa. And he's been there ever since. I mean, he's maybe 90 years old now, and he, when everybody else fled Liberia because of the new disease that came in, he said, the flock knows its shepherd. I'm not going anywhere, and he stayed throughout the crisis. Cosmos, really, the whole mission in Zaire is a labor of love. Zaire is not a fun place to live. It's war torn. It's jungle. It's in the back of nowhere. And the missionaries that have gone there and done missionary work are truly remarkable people. There's been this sort of international pan-Orthodox movement since the 1970s to actually do some genuine missionary work in Africa. But even then, it's tricky because you don't want to do it. You don't want to do Orthodoxy for them. And the more heroic and the more exceptional and the more remarkable the missionaries are, the more the story becomes about the missionaries, and the less the story becomes about Africans and their own Orthodox Church. And so it's tricky. I mean, you have to find a balance there. Missionary work is good, but I had an African priest who once told me, "You have no idea how valuable a white man without objectives of his own can be." I said, having a white man who will stand there to attract interest or for people to send checks to, is extremely helpful, because we're invisible. But as soon as he develops a plan of his own, then all of a sudden it's about him, and it's not about the needs of the local Orthodox community here in the country. So we need more white people to bring attention to Orthodoxy in Africa, but who don't come to Africa with their own plans for how Africans ought to do it. And I think there's some truth to that. So for the last 5 years, I've been trying to be the white guy who stood there and doesn't have opinions. But, everybody's got opinions, right?
So besides these three countries, you said Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Is it any place that you said Zambia?
Yeah, Orthodoxy is pretty much everywhere in Africa now. It's just those communities were the places where where a kind of indigenous African Orthodoxy first started. And it kind of spread from there. And then once the missionary effort got started, the missionaries came into places like Nigeria and Ghana and Malawi and Zimbabwe and so forth. So but it's more institutional, and it's more run by Patriarch Constantinople, and it's got more connections generally with the earlier Greek populations of those communities, and is only gradually spreading out into the African communities there. So often, like in Malawi, for the longest time, all the services were in Greek. All the priests were white. I first discovered Orthodoxy in Africa, and I love that community. But it wasn't really about Africa or Africans. It was about serving the needs of the Greeks who actually lived there.
So how strong is the presence of the Ethiopian church those countries we're talking about, Uganda and Kenya,
What church?
Ethiopian, because they're
The Ethiopian church is already there, for instance, in South Africa, the Ethiopians could never get recognized because they were an African indigenous body, so they couldn't buy communion wine. They had to join with heretics of one sort or another so that they could obtain communion wine under the South African apartheid rules. I mean, the Europeans weren't any fonder of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church than they were, our variety of the Orthodox Church. But after independence, they have mobilized, and they've done a pretty good job. There's a much nicer Coptic cathedral in Kampala than there is an Orthodox cathedral, and they have expanded throughout sub-Saharan Africa. I have no idea how to gauge the comparison between the two bodies. The Africans themselves don't tend to see quite as big a rift between themselves and the Ethiopian Orthodox. I mean, they recognize that they're not in communion, but they tend to see them as sort of fellow travelers, in ways that I think probably would make some American Orthodox a bit uncomfortable. But it just reflects the reality of the thing. Ethiopian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox churches in Africa look more like one another than like anything else that's going on in Africa, and so there's a tendency to form a kind of natural allegiance there.
Wouldn't that be good Coptics to kind of get into the passing or whatever to do to make them in communion?
Yeah, I mean, it's above our pay grades. I'm sure that there's people from Russia and Greece and etc. who are having those meetings and making those discussions right now. But I mean,
Before the war, it was very common for the Coptic bishops to be in Moscow. It was happening every couple months, and maybe more than that. Every couple months there was something on the patriarch's site, which means it was very public, and they were trying to make it public. So something was brewing. Who knows what it is? But some conversations, and those are always good. So,
I mean, if that rift is ever, if that schism is ever healed, I mean, it'll make an enormous difference to Africa. I mean, be able to combine those resources.
Thank you, Father. I was just wondering about the crucifix that you brought. There's that African. It looks African. I was just wondering if that's like a missionary tool to depict Christ that way.
No, it's the Africans do it.
Oh.
That's a very controversial thing. I just brought them because they're beautiful. Some of it, it can be blamed on the wood. I mean, ebony's black, so you can't carve a crucifix out of it without having a black Jesus kind of thing. But clearly, Japanese icons sometimes, the characters in the icons look very Japanese, and there is also a tendency toward that. There's the icon of the Theotokos there, with the Ugandan script. Ugandan script is an example of an icon which, while clearly classical and traditional in form, nevertheless is appealing to the notion of a Mary that is more like us, kind of thing. And it's controversial, but perhaps
not
not
like us.
Not like us, but like them us. Actually, I have a great icon of Christ, Christ in the temple, the icon of Christ the teacher, as a 14-year-old boy or 12-year-old boy, and from Africa. That is very definitely an African representation, but done completely in traditional materials, completely done like we would do an icon. And then I have a Russian Orthodox icon that was given to me when our parish first started, that has a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus of exactly the same sort. And side by side, they're exactly the same size, and they're exactly the same pose. One of them's African and one of them's blonde and blue-eyed. I wanted to bring it, but my wife has the icon of the icon of the African icon in her office, so I wasn't able to grab it before I left. But I thought it was a kind of amusing juxtaposition. And this is a problem for Orthodoxy too. I mean, because they were so ignored for a long period of time, they did develop some independent things. For instance, almost anywhere in Africa, in the communion line, you got to wait a long time for communion in Africa because there's like 500 people, okay? You know, and the little kids are coming back for more bread, you know, over and over and over again. All the little orphan kids are like, you know, they make these huge loaves and cut them into, you know, pieces. But because you have to wait in communion for such a long time, they've developed a kind of dance line for it. So everybody's, you know, doing this number in a long line all the way to the back of the church. And I mean, it's very respectful, it's very traditional, it's kind of greeting that you would do for a chief or whatever else. Within their culture, it's, you know, it makes perfect sense. But you get Americans or, you know, Europeans, you know, who have their own notions of like, you know, proper decorum in church, and this is just appalling. You know, when a bishop shows up to a community, the women are all out doing their traditional dances, you know, to welcome the leader, you know, and the dances get pretty wild sometimes. And you think, wow, you know, it's like, what can you say? I mean, it's a different kind of culture, and I think a certain degree of acceptance. We think, I mean, when Orthodoxy moved from one place to another in the past, there was no internet. There was no one to take pictures. And so gradually music changed without anybody noticing. The way icons were done changed without anybody noticing. Little modifications in the services changed without anybody noticing. So the difference between Byzantine music and Russian choral music is huge. But it happened gradually, and there wasn't anybody with like, you know, their little phone saying, oh, no, that's not the way we do it in Constantinople. You know, you can't do that. You can't make those kind of changes. Those are innovations. Okay, it just happened. But Africans, until very recently, didn't have the phones, and they didn't have any way of accessing what it looked like in Europe, or what it looked like in Constantinople, or what it looked like in Moscow. So they were kind of winging it. Well, now they've grown up. 2 generations, 3 generations of Africans have been doing Orthodoxy like this. And now people come in and say, well, no, you can't do that. I mean, you can't have a dance light in church. And they're like, well, my father and my grandfather used to do it. So, I mean, you know, some flexibility there I think is going to be a good idea. Particularly, I mean, if Moscow does move into Africa in a big way, I think they're going to have to be a little bit more flexible on some of that stuff than is generally the case.
Well, isn't that when it goes to nation still adapts to its own things that, you know, only in this nation, you know?
It didn't work out too well for Americans, and I'm not sure that it's working too well for Africans either. I mean, yeah, that's the ideal. I mean,
because America is still melting
very
pot.
young melting pot. I know.
So you cannot just cut out the language, right? Because there's a lot of people who speak only this, not.
Another problem that Africa's got that we haven't talked about is ethnicity and language. They have their own ethnic problems. They have their own ethnic infighting. You might think they'd be thrilled to have an African, a Ugandan citizen bishop. But there were a lot of people who were very unhappy about the new Metropolitan Hieronymus because he's not Buganda. He's from one of the other tribes, which is why he originally got sent to Tanzania instead of going to Uganda in the first place. And so there's that. And there's also translation issues. There are hundreds and hundreds of languages. And so being able to translate the enormous size of these services, I mean, in the Antiochian church, they don't do the canons for Matin. And they're just not there. Well, I didn't learn until many years later why that was the case. And when they switched from Greek to Arabic, there wasn't translations because service has always been done in Greek, and there wasn't any translations of these things into Arabic at the time. So in order to do the services in Arabic, they just had to drop them. And they only translated the first hymn of each canon. And so that's why the canon in the Antiochian church has just like gone away. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't they were hacking away at the services. They just didn't have any versions of it in Arabic, and that's how it developed. And it's the same way in Africa. There are lots of services that just don't exist. They can't do Great Compline in the first week of Lent because they got no translation for it. And so they have to do something else, which means they innovate. But they want to worship. So they find another way. They find another way to do it.
Going along with that, has anyone thought about like implementing like a new language like Slavonic so that they can all have that?
Common.
East Africa. Yeah. I have never learned Church Slavonic, so I can avoid being pressured to do that. So I'm probably not but East Africa has a language, Swahili, which works in that context in many places, and most of the services have been translated in Swahili. But in Uganda, Idi Amin saw Swahili as a foreign thing, so he suppressed the teaching of Swahili, and so an entire generation of Ugandans didn't learn it. So it's not very helpful in Uganda.
But do a lot of people in Uganda, at least in the cities, speak English?
Yes, and English is becoming a replacement, but then of course that's a problem. We're going to have an African religion, and we're going to come to church and we're going to do it in English.
It's interesting, the bishop that was appointed by Moscow speaks English very well.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a mistake.
Well, that was not a mistake. I mean, you really do have to have somebody who can understand English, because it's English and Swahili. Well, English, French, and Swahili will get you anywhere in Africa. It's just. But it's interesting. The services get translated in languages in the seminary by guys who come from some culture. They translate the services, but they never get used. And I didn't know why that was the case. In fact, sometimes they've been translated 5-6 times by the same ethnic group, and their services are never used. Anyway, I've got a guy in Eastern Bunyoro tribe in Uganda who's doing the process of getting all the services of the church into his native language. He said it's been translated several times, but it was never brought before the elders of the tribe. And no one will respect the translation or will acknowledge the translation as a legitimate or valid translation unless the elders of the tribe vet it and agree that it is the case. And so he has to have a little banquet and invite them, and they read the service. They talk about whether this is a good translation for that word and that sort of thing. And it's a month-long process whereby they vet the services, and then these are not Orthodox people. But they're interested in how their language is being used and whether or not things are being translated properly. And then at the end of it, they give their blessing. And then the church not only has the blessing, of the people who, of the Orthodox Church, but they also have the blessing of the tribe to use this language in their services, and that this language is being used accurately and correctly. And some of those kinds of things are things that now need to be done. More of that needs to occur.
Why does Africa in such a position, with such a good land to have, right? And it seems like all of the Western countries that involved in it, keeping it this way, it seems like it.
I'll tell you a quick story. Some of you guys who are older may remember the rock and roll, Africa Aid concerts, U2, Bono, all of those things. Ethiopia was one of the principal recipients of that. Ethiopia, the 2 years before the Aid concert and all of that effort to save the Africans, had bumper crops 2 years in a row. They had more grain than they knew what to do with. So the Ethiopian government went to the World Bank and said, look, we can use a traditional method. We can actually bury them in sand dunes. We can hollow them out, and we can cover it, and we can save that so that when we have a bad year, which happens from time to time because of weather conditions, we will have the grain that we need. And the world government wouldn't forward them the money for the bulldozers to be able to create the cheap storage silos, saying that it would be cheaper, it's more effective for you to sell it now and pay off your pay off some of your debt to the World Bank. And if you do have problems in the future, we'll be able to buy corn cheap from the United States and wheat cheap from Russia. And so as a consequence, when they actually got 2 years later, when they actually got a terrible year and there was no food, they discovered there was no infrastructure for getting the American corn and the Russian wheat to the people in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in any kind of reasonable amount of time. So it was midway through the second year before any of this wheat that was purchased by the World Bank got to people and people could start actually eating it in Ethiopia. The mindset of Europeans doesn't often match the realities on the ground. Africa is still an extractive economy. They have oil, but they don't refine it. They have diamonds, but they don't grade them. They don't make jewelry. They grow cotton, but they don't have a clothing industry. No matter what it is, tobacco, tea, those things just in the raw form go to Europe. And then in Europe, in the factories, they make things out of them, and they get 90% of the value as value addition from the industrial process. None of that money goes back to Africa because Africans only have to be paid for the extraction process. And if you can get some corrupt government official to give you great rates if you give them a kickback, then you can practically recreate colonialism where no money is going into the hands of actual Africans for the product that is poisoning their land or causing the social problems in their community. In Zaire, you were talking about the Congo, in Zaire, the products that we use in our phones and computers are being mined there. And it's terrible things for the community, children mining, dreadful community problems, but it's not helping Zaire. It's not helping the Congo. They're not getting any of the money. Some government officials are getting to line their pockets, but most of the write-up is going to. So Africa is the benefactor of the world, not voluntarily, but because everybody has made sure that wealth goes out of Africa without any capital going back into Africa to enable Africans to be able to consolidate or keep any of that wealth in their own country. And and of course you say that too loud, somebody's going to call you a socialist or whatever, but it's just true.
Obviously it doesn't work for the country, so.
No. And now you've got China. You got China and everybody else in the game too. But one of the things that's helping the spread of Orthodoxy in places like Kenya is that the British sequestered so much of the land, and now people like Bill Gates and the Chinese and everybody's like buying up land in Africa, which means if you're an ordinary family in Africa, you got 1.5 acres of land you're providing for your family on, and then you have children, and now you have the next generation. It's 2 families or 3 families, and they just can't survive on the 1 acre. But there's no land available locally because of the land pressure, so you got to go somewhere. And so Orthodox people are moving to extreme rural areas or places out in the boonies where they can manage to obtain some land, and they're taking the Orthodox faith with them. And so it's spreading, but at the cost of impoverishing the community. This was fun. Thank you.
Other questions for Father Cassian? All right, let's thank Father Cassian for coming. Young people and young at heart, 4 o'clock at my house will be Father Cassian. I'll be there. We'll be able to talk to one a little more close quarters, and you're welcome to be there.